Hi to everyone who's joining us. This is Nickel Times Legal Cluster, and today we'll be discussing on a recommendation put forth by the Supreme Court on uh, private prisons being built as part of corporate social responsibilities and how that might affect the prison system in India at large. Um, so, a bit of a brief on the Indian prison system. The Indian prison system at the moment leaves a lot to be desired, with prison population as per 2021 NCRB data at 77% with the prisoners at under trials, while only 22% are convicts, and with almost half of the under trials in prison for have been classified as under trials for the last 2 years. India's Supreme Court, through various judgments, has enumerated several rules that need to be kept in mind when it comes to Indian prisoners, which is that every person is entitled to their own personal liberty, and just because they've been imprisoned, that doesn't mean that they become a non-person as per the Indian Constitution. A person who commits an offense is also entitled to all kinds of human rights, which is something that is often found lacking in Indian prison system. And a person is already suffering for the commission of crime by punishment, then no other suffering be imbued onto them. And while the Supreme Court of India has paid great importance related to the various issues of prisons, such as lack of proper healthcare and medical facilities, overcrowding, and other provision of facilities, as well as legal aid, which is expressly a part of the as per the Constitution of India, the reality leaves a lot to be desired. So, the first issue that we would like to discuss is how are Indian prisons operated, and what are some of the concerns that have been raised time and time again regarding these prisons. Shreya, please go ahead.
I'd start off by talking about how even our formalized prison system came into existence. So that was because when the British took over India, that was when our our prison system became more organized. At that time, also they recognized that the condition of the prisons were abysmal, and even Lord Macaulay at that time set up a committee for it was called the Prison Discipline Committee to sort of channelize the work and make it more streamlined. So that was the first time ever they took up a measure to reform the prison system in India. But moving forward, now I'd fast forward to the modern time, like post-independence India. So our prison system is based on the Prison Act of 1894. So which was again what the British did, but that the current system is also based on that. And again, the prison system in India is a state subject. Although the central government does have some involvement in it, most of the decision making is done by the state governments. So now, if we look at the prisons in currently in India, one of the major issue, as you talked about, is overcrowding. Other issues that are also very prevalent is like supposedly the sexual abuse of women in the prisons. India does have certain, you could call them women's jail in India, but the number of women's jails is very less. There are like about 20 women's jails in India, and they're already filled up over the capacity. So that sort of pushes a lot of women to get
I think we lost
can
you
you
there
hear
for a second. Yeah,
my call?
we
Yeah,
can hear you now. Yeah, you can go ahead.
okay, the Wi-Fi. I don't know. So yeah, so as I was talking about the women's jails, and the problem in for women in these jails are like the general jails, we could say, is that the number of male attendants, the male guards, is outnumber the number of female guards. So a lot of these women, in order to even get basic necessities, supposedly in winters they want blankets and other things. They have to perform certain favors for these guards in order to even get that. So what I'm saying is, so this is sort of like the condition of women right now. And then if I talk about the different kinds of jails in India, there are central jails, there are district jails, and there is Boston schools. I'm just saying the name. It's sort of a youth detention center, but the problem is that even these are very less. So a lot of these kids, or you could, some of them are juveniles, and some of them are very young children, whose crimes are not, very extreme, but then they also have to be put in the regular jails because of the overcapacity that these jails suffer from. So again, they are sort of put next to hardened criminals, which can obviously impact and influence them into a instead of reforming them, it makes their situation worse. So yeah, that's is what my basic overview.
Thank you for providing the brief, Shreya. The next thing that we want to discuss is what kind of prison reforms have been suggested and implemented in the past. Shreya, please go ahead.
Audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. All right. So I'll start by talking about the Mullah Committee and the suggestions that they had on jail reforms. Um so basically, um Justice A.N. Mullah chaired All India Committee on Jail Reforms from 1980 to 1983, and some of the prominent suggestions that the Mullah Committee gave, I will be discussing those firstly. So they mentioned that the conditions of prisons throughout the country should be improved by making adequate provisions, such as provisions for sanitation and food and clothing and ventilation and other basic necessary things. Secondly, the prison staff should be adequately trained and organized um, properly. So they mentioned that it would be sensible to establish an all India service known as the Indian Prisons and Correctional Service to recruit prison officials across the country. And the media and the general public should be allowed to visit prisons and other correctional institutions regularly to get a first-hand information about the conditions inside prisons. And they should be willing to work with prison officials on rehabilitation projects. They also argued that the number of undertrials in prisons should be reduced to a bare minimum and that they should be kept apart from the other convicted inmates. Because undertrials account for a sizable portion of the prison population, their numbers can be reduced through expedited trials and the liberalization of bail provisions. And lastly, they mentioned that the government should make a proper and a substantial effort to provide sufficient resources and funds for prison reforms. Then the government of India later appointed the Justice Krishna Iyer Committee in 1987 to conduct a study on the women prisoners in India. And the Krishna Iyer Committee advocated for recruiting more women to the police force due to their they felt that it would help the female prisoners and the juvenile offenders more. And then I also want to talk about the steps that the government of India took for the administration of prison reforms in India. Now, the government of India requested that changes be implemented by the state governments in various union territories to ensure proper administration of changes to improve the measures for prison reform. Now, the various measures that were discussed were firstly in review committees at the state and district levels for the under trial prisoner population, poor and vulnerable prisons with legal assistance and appoint part-time or whole-time law officers in prison. Thirdly, it was to strictly adhere to the provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973 regarding methods for investigation and inquiry. Thirdly, it was discussed that one of the prison reforms can be to develop a time-bound plan to improve prisoners' living conditions. For example, developments can be made on the facilities and basic living conditions that were provided to the prisoners. These could be developed and made better, and to submit all these plans for approval to the Ministry of Home Affairs. Lastly, it was one of the measures that were recommended were to establish a state board of visitors to visit prisons regularly and report on conditions in the jails for consideration by the state government.
You know, when it comes to making laws for prisons, India is never really behind per se, but it's when it comes to catching up with actual facilities that we fall short. Uh, as Ishita talked about the Iyer, I think Iyer committee, yeah, in 1987, and um, they were making laws which were relevant to the women at that point in time, even for pregnant women, and how they could keep their children with them till a certain point, and creating creches and nurseries within the prison, because till a certain time you need that form of biological bonding for a child. At least that was what was scientifically believed at the time. Um, that debate is something else. Let's not. My mind is going to that. But anyway, but the fact of the matter is they were trying to come up with laws. But a lot of women who were wrongly accused, a case from the Muzaffarnagar prison in 2015, a woman who was wrongly accused for a crime was sent there in a place which was meant for 30 women, 100 women will live in. Overcrowding is a humongous problem in the Indian prison system, and we often hear cases for men rather than women, because women prisons are even lesser than those that are there for men. So their problems are kind of hidden away in within the numbers, within the big numbers of male convicts, and the problems exist for men as well. And the fact of the matter is, talking having prisons as a responsibility of the government, or the government ever having them as part of their agenda, is never really a priority for them, because let's face it, who wants to hear about prison reforms in an election manifesto, or who wants to care about what happens to prisoners in an election, when a government is contesting for elections? So in the light of that, I think a lot of weightage needs to be given to the suggestion put forth by Justice K.M. Joseph. And I especially liked how he noted, like, there has been a positive effect on corporate spending on prisons, if you look at the case of Europe, which he quoted as well. And barring that, there is also the reality that he wasn't talking about private uh, private companies and corporations kind of deciding what happens in the prisons. He talked about them just making the structures, or them just making the buildings required, and handing them over to the government, and how they could receive certain benefits. So, in terms of, I feel, again, in the light of this government and their, uh, uh, their support for public-private partnerships, I feel like this is something that they should take up. But well, who listens to us? Anyway, who else wants to talk on this? Go ahead, Gayatri.
Okay, so it is true that the suggestion of private prisons has been pretty popular recently, and when we look at the world over, there are many countries which have adopted it, of which United States, Australia, and United Kingdom are among the topmost countries which have a lot of functional private prisons of various kinds. So when we talk about private prisons, I think we need to also clarify as to what exactly this means. So when we say a private prison or a public-private partnership in terms of prison management, it can take form of three different forms. So either the private companies will provide the services required, while the actual carceral facility is both owned and managed by the government. This is one type where you have minimal level of private interference in the form of services that they provide to the inmates. It could be cleaning or canteen facilities and such. The other kind is when it is actually managed by the private corporations, while the actual carceral facility is owned by the government. This is the other form, which is quite prevalent in United States and United Kingdom and Australia. The third kind is where the private corporations both own and manage the carceral facility, and they instead charge the government a certain amount of fee for the maintenance of the inmates. Now, this is the kind that is often cited when people say that this is the way to go ahead, this is the future, because this way we will end up reducing the cost incurred by the government. Because creating prisons, maintaining that amount of infrastructure, security measures, looking after inmates, especially when we have a huge crowding problem where most of the prisons in India are over 100% occupational rate. In fact, Uttar Pradesh, we have prisons with over 119% occupation, and that's not a healthy system for us to continue with, which is why they say if we were to have a private prison, which is completely owned and managed by a private corporation, and they charge a certain fee, the government would end up actually reducing their expenses as opposed to both owning, managing, and providing all these services. Now, while we talk about prisons, so in simpler way, before we go ahead to talk about the particulars about this particular reform, is to look at some basic pros and cons that many people talk about in this discussion. So pros being, of course, the cost will be reduced, so there won't be much physical burden on the government. The other being that it's also safer because these are private prisons, you will end up having more safer circumstance. A safer environment, there will be better facilities, which, and also because private corporations in general are flexible in their operations, they will be better accommodating when it comes to prisoners' need. However, it is also necessary that we do not ignore the expenses that the public will incur. It is true that the government will end up possibly reducing its physical burden. However, the expenses incurred by the public still remain high. The families and the communities from which most of the people get incarcerated would still end up paying a huge bill. And also, is it principally, legally and constitutionally correct to delegate the state's responsibility of law and order, of maintaining prisons to a private entity? Is this feasible at all, principally, legally, and constitutionally? And especially when we have private prisons for gain, to what extent is it actually good for the society? Because the reason why private prisons are a billion-dollar industry is because they earn money when there are people put inside the prison. And so the concept is not over here reforming individuals and sending them out, because that goes against what they are doing. In private prisons, they basically commodify the idea of that institution, the prison, and the prisoner there is also commodified as an object. Like, how many prisoners can you have on your shelf for you to make money? And is that something that we can appreciate in our society right now, especially when we are looking trends towards rehabilitative justice, retributive justice, where we are mostly focusing on ensuring that there are less people who get into the prison? And I guess there is this very um, emotive quote as well about prisons, saying that the more prisons you build, the more ways you find to fill it up. So over here, is private prisons really what we're looking for? Because that doesn't necessarily sound good for the society. And recently, and I understand the reports also mention the United States and the other countries, especially when it comes to positive depictions of private prisons, they refer to United States and Australia and United Kingdom, saying, you see, these countries have done such a good job, maybe we should also try our hand at it. But recently in 2017, we have Department of Justice, Office of uh, Inspector General, who submitted a report which stated the condition of inmates in private prisons and has noted that they have less rehabilitative services, and that these prisons have poor condition and they poorly treat their inmates, and also the safety infrastructure there is worse than federal prisons. So the whole idea, this myth that private prisons are better placed than federal prisons to deliver on these grounds, has been um, challenged by this report, which stated that private prisons actually don't do that good of a job. If anything, they're doing worse, which is why before Trump administration took office, there was an order released which said that we are now going to stop using private prisons and cut down on them. And it's only in 2016, after the Trump administration came into the office, they basically revoked this order. But now again, under Biden administration, there is this order still effective that says that we're going to cut down on usage of private prisons. I mean, go down, um, um, basically dismantle this private prison infrastructure. One last point before we allow Amisha and Shreya to pitch in is basically another case that we really need to look forward is to understand the constitutional challenges that are posed to private prisons. Is it even feasible legally in India? So for this, we need to look at the case of Israel. So Israel in 2009 has this landmark case in which the Supreme Court, the apex court of the Israel, has mentioned that having private prisons is detrimental because it actually violates the human rights and dignity of the prisoners. And also, when it comes to private prisons, the state cannot delegate its constitutional duty to protect the people and incarcerate and look after the safety of the people by giving it to the private corporations. This is constitutionally not valid. And because of this constitutional challenge, the concept of private prisons is not legally possible when it comes to Israel. And given that Israel, United States, and even in United States, there were many cases which did pose this a challenge when it comes to completely owned and managed private prisons, which is why we only have partial private prisons in the sense that they will probably provide services or they will probably manage it, but they don't exactly own the prisons. Which is, and given that our legal system is quite similar to theirs, all of us are in common law realm, it's important to know that possibly even if we do consider private prisons, it's not possible because we'll have constitutional challenges when it comes to whether or not can the state delegate this part of its duty to a private corporation, and also what does it mean when it comes to the human rights of the inmates, because like I said, when you privatize something, you're also commodifying the people and the infrastructure there, and that goes against the inherent principle of human dignity. And it probably will also be held back because of the landmark judgment in Hussein Ara Khatun versus Home Secretary in 1979, which in which the Apex Code laid out a very big list of rights that even the inmates have and cannot be infringed upon by the state itself. So with this in mind, I see the possibility of private prisons not having a great future in India. Instead, we should try and focus on the other methods like open prisons, which is a very interesting concept that has been practiced in few places, because especially when it comes to female inmates, the thing is most of the female inmates are only the sole breadwinners in their family. They have children that they need to look after. For them to be completely cut off from their family and the community and to be incarcerated not only affects their chances of getting a good job later on, and it also has detrimental impact when it comes to reintegration into the community, which is why certain places have open prison system in India as well. I'm sorry, the names don't come to my mind at the moment, but there are open systems where women can go back to the houses, they can live in the community, but at the same time they serve a certain amount of their time in the prison where they get rehabilitative services, and this has actually shown a positive impact. Now, one final point before we move on, I know I've taken quite time, is an interesting thing that we're seeing when it comes to PPP, private and public partnership. While we do not have necessarily any owned or managed private prisons in India, there is a very interesting public-private contribution that we need to look out for, which is that Tihar Central Jail, and DEIEM Indian and Century Private Limited have a tie-up. Similarly, Old Surat Central Jail and Sabarmati Central Jail have a tie-up with other private corporations which deal with snacks. And Yerawada Central Jail has a partnership with Spark Minda, which is basically about assembling automobiles. So what exactly these private partnerships show is that they essentially work with private corporations to sell the goods that the inmates are making, such as handlooms, tailored materials. And when it comes to Sabarimala Central Jail, etc., they prepare snacks. So they basically have a tie-up with the private partnerships, which will sell these goods. And later on, once these inmates are have finished their sentences, have completely served their sentence, upon their release, they're basically employed by these companies. And after the recent partnership between the Yerawada Central Jail and Spark Minda, Maruti Suzuki and Mahindra have shown interest in working in similar tie-ups where they work with the inmates. They will contribute the labor for assembling of automobile parts, etc. And once they're released, they're actually absorbed into this company as full-time employees, which is rather innovative and seems like it beats most of the cons of otherwise private prisons idea. So this is again something that we need to look forward to. Thank you.
Nisha?
I think that was something really interesting that Gayatri brought up. And of course, when we talk about private prisons, there are a lot more concerns than, let's say, advantages that we can think of. And it's not a debate that started just recently. It's been ongoing for a very long time, especially with globalization and ideas flowing from abroad. This has become more and more popular, and it's a part of contemporary discourse. But I think what is quite interesting about the recent suggestion by the SC about CSR-funded prisons, I won't exactly delve into calling them private prisons just yet, but one thing I found quite interesting was that how this, let me give you a little bit of context about how this question even came up. So a discussion started regarding overcrowding of jails and lack of facilities when the Supreme Court was hearing a petition regarding moving this prison inmate called Gautam Navlakha, I might get the pronunciation wrong, to be shifted from the prison to house arrest from Taloja jail owing to health reasons. So this entire question came up because there were a lot of health issues that this individual was going through, for which they required certain special provisions and to be shifted out. But like I think Shreya also talked about it, and even actually both Shreyas talked about it, about how there is a lack of facilities. I think according to the National Crime Records Bureau, Indian prison population stood at about more than 5.5 lakh in December 2021, as against a total of 1,319 establishments, which included central jails, district jails, sub jails, women jails, open jails, and of course, juvenile homes, etc. All of these things. So what is interesting here is that you have so many people and very little place to actually put them. So questions like this, when you have medical emergencies, when you have health reasons where you need to segregate people, how do you do that? And one of the most important points that came up in this discussion was about how you deal with undertrials. Undertrials are not convicts. They are still people who are undergoing a trial to be convicted or to be left scot-free. Sorry, to be yeah. So the question now comes up: should they be placed in prisons with people who have been convicted? Because the axiom of principal justice, criminal justice, is very clear that you are innocent until you're proven guilty. So is it correct to subject them to all of those restrictions that a convict is subjected to? So this concept of an anticipatory jail is what actually came up in this discussion about CSR-funded prisons. So the idea that you have private jails or you have separate institutions to hold these under trials. So don't, like, currently what happens is if you're arrested and you have a case against you, you're directly put into prison until your trial is over. So an idea of separating convicts and keeping them in prisons and like separate anticipatory jails. This is the idea that was actually floated by the Supreme Court when they were talking about these CSR-funded prisons. And I think it's a great idea because honestly, like it was brought up earlier, why would anyone want to spend public money on prisons when you can have it being spent on health, on education, on infrastructure, and a lot many other things? So what needs to be done here is when we think of public-private partnership, most commonly it's usually the government tends to give in land or given some basic infrastructure, and then the public or the private companies come in and take over all of those things. So maybe I think we could imagine this CSR funded prisons from a slightly different point of view. Like, let's say that you have the corporate sector coming in building these prisons, so that there is some sense of proper infrastructure, because there's also a lot of discussion and debate and anger about the way people are treated in prisons also. I mean, yes, there is some sort of limitation on the rights and rights available to prisoners, but they also deserve some basic human rights. So that will also be catered to. Let's say if you have private companies coming up and setting up proper prisons, because most of the Indian prisons today are the ones that were constructed during colonial times. So we all know the condition of those prisons. You have more than 100% capacity in those prisons. You have like 200 people living in a place where there should just be 100, or you have 100 people living in a place where there should only be 30 or 40 people. So you'll have proper establishments, and then these can be run, let's say, by the government. Of course, one of the biggest problems today is also understaffing. But we can also imagine this as, let's say, more job employment, getting government jobs in the form of prisons, in the form of, let's say, people in the, like I think Ishita had brought it up, in a in a prison service. Because I think one of the other problems also with Indian prisons is that the application for becoming jail staff is the cutoff is very, very bare minimum. So you can just have basic education and you can become a prison staff, which also has negative repercussions to the people inside prisons. So I think setting up of these anticipatory jails will really help resolve this issue of overcrowding, because the maximum number of people in prisons, unfortunately, today are under trials and not convicts. So one, you will also sort of deal with this constitutional question of should under trials be treated in the same way as prisoners are. So this idea of a CSR funded prison is quite good, because it's and let's look at it from this anticipatory jail rather than a perfectly private prison, because I think that'll take us into the debate that I think Gayatri's already talked about, which is quite important. Like, how do you deal with private prisons in a country like India? I mean, everyone relies on the government, and it's the government's duty, at the very least, to be dealing with issues of correction, of rehabilitation. And let's say the government, why do we have the condition of our prisons today is what? Because we don't want to spend money on them. So if let's say the CSR is what is responsible for making these prisons, you'll have a decent infrastructure, and then they can be managed. So you're targeting one bird, like multiple things with just one stone. You have decent infrastructure, you're giving some basic rights, you have proper access to food, shelter, water in prisons for inmates, and at the same time you're also aggregating government money or taxpayers money to things that are equally important or more important in like a common man's eye. So I think let's look at this issue of anticipatory jails, or in the form of CSR funded prisons, is something quite interesting, which should probably be debated further. I think I'll let Gayatri come in.
Gayatri, please start.
Yeah, so wonderful points put forth by Amisha. So that actually sort of teased the debate ahead, especially when she talked about the anticipatory jails for under trial prisoners, and how this could also potentially be a good way to boost employment when we have more people, when we solve the issue of understaffing by employing more people to look after these anticipatory jails funded by CSR. Now, but so I think when we especially talk about under trial prisoners and issues of employment, etc., we need to also look at it in a broader framework of criminal law reform. Because when we talk about private prisons or anticipatory jails, essentially, what is the goal that we are aiming for, right? So when we put it in the context of the larger criminal law reform, does it help our case to have more and more prisons and more people staffed to take care of them? Especially the whole idea of anticipatory jails is also because of the huge number of under trial prisoners, where in some cases there are actually more than convicts who ought to be in jails and prisons. So the fact is that the root cause at the end of the day is our flawed criminal law justice system that we should be focused on remedying by having more robust infrastructure that delivers justice at a faster pace than it does now, dealing with the backlogs, dealing with the vacancies in our courts itself, right? So all of these are necessary so that we actually bring down the number of under trial prisoners. And for the time being, to manage the overcrowding, etc., anticipatory jails are the way ahead, as proposed by the courts as well. But we should also be focusing on the larger idea of criminal law reform, where we also discuss the possibilities of open prisons, the retributive justice, whether prisons should be existing in a modern world at all in the first place. So all of these also need to be considered when we discuss these possibilities.
I think another thing needs to be kept in mind, especially because I feel that was brought forth in my head when you talked about how exploitative private prisons can be, is the fact that in India, which is a statistic that should be reducing is increasing, is the fact that lower caste people make up a much larger portions in jail than upper caste people, and that portion has increased by 10%. Even I remember we did legal class itself a year ago. We were doing a similar debate, and that time it was about mental health in the prison system. and how much weightage that should be given. And we were discussing how even if you look at death row inmates, a scary majority are lower caste people, a scary majority. And if you think about who is exploited in society, and I feel the more capitalist we get with something like private prisons, with as which is something that, which it didn't really I didn't interpret prisons as such, which was the fact that of governments giving away their basically pawning off their the constitutional responsibility, which is not something I interpreted, which is exactly that. It's exploiting, it's exploiting the same class of people that you exploit outside the prison system. You're systematically doing it. You're systematically making them cogs in a machine for your profits. And I feel that's what I think Justice K.M. Joseph also wanted to emphasize, was the fact that that these prisons as part of CSR should be private entities just building these prisons up and then getting some other kind of concessions, but they need to be handled. And I feel there is a certainty on this. I hope there is a certainty on this within the Indian diaspora, is that prisons should be handled by government trained professionals. And I think it's really interesting. So I live quite near Tihar, like enough that I see it as I go from place to place. It's like 5-10 minutes away from my place. And it's always it's very upper caste and privilege, and very cloudy eyed for me to say, but they've painted, they have graffiti on there, and they have poetry on their walls. It's beautiful graffiti. And I remember meeting some of the artists, and it was it was a social thing organized, where an NGO came, approached artists and asked them to paint the prison walls. And they also have a couple of restaurants which are run by the work of prisoners in Tihar. And I feel Tihar, in a way, at least they're trying to train train prisoners with skills that they can use as soon as they get out, which is something. And as the case of Maruti Suzuki, and these things are completely different. It's like training them for labor. But a lot of American prisons have been accused of exploiting labor at a much lower wage than they would normal citizens. But and if they, but if our governments can ensure that there is proper wage being provided, which they can't for normal citizens, so I doubt they will for citizens in prison. So again, it's a mess of a system outside the prison. I doubt they'll be able to ensure a system without a mess inside it. So, Gayatri, you're next, right? Who raised their hand next? I'm sorry. Gayatri, go ahead.
Gayatri, go ahead.
Okay. So also, Shreya also pointed out the issue of accountability and oversight. How exactly would the accountability and oversight in situations of anticipatory jail look like? And also, importantly, especially when we talk about the convict leasing, what Shreya mentioned about convicts basically being leased for work for a very low rate, to the point that it is seen as modern labor, modern slavery. So when it comes to convict leasing, the reason why that was the case in the United States also has its roots in slavery, because most of the plantations were the ones which were turned into carceral facilities, right? And also in the Jim Crow era, we had most of the black population, which were the highest number of people inside these carceral facilities, so that they could continue to have labor force at a cheap rate. So we might have similar issues if we were to have private controlled prisons, because the same marginalized people outside the prison system will be essentially forced to work at a lower rate, because that is still better than no work at all, given that now they have criminal record at place. So yeah.
Actually, I was thinking about something that came up from Gayatri's the quote that Gayatri talked about how the more prisons you make, the more prisoners you look for. And it just took me to the idea of prison infrastructure. Because when you think about a prison, To be very honest, when I thought about prisons, the first thing that came to my mind was, let's say, US prisons, which involved cells, like 2 people, 3 people, max 4 people living in one cell, or in certain cases, solitary confinement. But what's peculiar about Indian prisons, because most of them have been made during the colonial times, they are of a very different, like not very different, but of a slightly differing format from, let's say, prisons abroad. You have something like, let's say, a big room with multiple people living in that. And because of the overcrowding, naturally much more than there should be inside. So this idea of solitary confinement is lesser because you already have very little space. So you're using one room for multiple people rather than having solitary confinement. And the Indian Penal Code in itself limits the amount of solitary confinement you can have. And to be honest, if you have new prisons coming up, they will probably adopt the Western style of Western infrastructure of prisons, which is cells. So you probably might make cells for 2 people, for 4 people, and that automatically increases the chance of, the problems of mental health, lesser interaction with people, more brutality, more I am falling short for words here, but a very regressive system within prisons, however many violations of human rights you may have, the very fact that Indian prisons are crowded, you have interaction. So when that concept of interaction goes away, it's only going to make matters worse. Of course, that you can get into an entire debate about that, about what is correct and not correct for prisoners. They have committed crimes and certain limitations should be put on them. But this is one of the biggest issues, I think, worldwide when we talk about prisons, is about mental health of prisoners because of limited interactions, and especially for people being put into solitary. So with new prison infrastructure coming up, and especially if they're not, let's say, used as anticipatory jails, but as proper prisons where you have convicts living, this will become a very big matter, because honestly, whatever you say, the judge may pronounce certain limits on the amount of solitary confinement you can afford, but at the end of the day, it's the jailers and the prison staff who will eventually have control over it. And this culture of within prisons will also change. So it's I think it's a very, very complex issue that we have to look at. And ideally, let's say a starting point does come through where the corporate sector is being involved in making prisons. I think the starting point for anticipatory jails would be the best idea before jumping the gun and like having full-time prisons being operated by them. Because honestly, like all the issues that both of you had brought up about private prisons in the first place, we don't even know whether an anticipatory jail might be a good idea to even have being run by the private sector. You set it up, give it to the government, or do you want to have like private partners coming and taking care of that as well? Are you ready to commodify these individuals who are already deprived of their rights? So I think it's a very difficult issue to come to terms with, because on the one hand, you're looking at prisoners who've already done something wrong and gotten into jail, but at the same time, they are also human beings. They have basic dignity that they need to be assured. So anticipatory jails is probably a good idea that's been floated by the Supreme Court, but one of the biggest problems is, how do you implement it? Is it something that's feasible to be implemented in a country like India? Yeah.
I think that brings us to an end. I feel like we had a very interesting discussion discussing the state of Indian prison system and how that might be met with a combination of private prisons and the boon and the disadvantages of the same. I feel like this is an issue that we can keep on going on discussing, and it's something that we need to wait and see what happens, especially with regards to, I mean, either solution is at this point in time seems amateur to go forward with, but again, let's wait and see what happens. Thank you for joining in.